I'm Bob Topel, and our session here is on consumption, leisure, and household. So we have Professors Consumption, Leisure, and Household. Actually, we have Erik Hurst, who will go first, who's a professor in the Graduate School of Business. Then Rob Townsend from the Economics Department, and Bruce Meyer from the Public Policy School. I was interested in Steve's comments because, I was impressed he took calculus in high school. I didn't even know he had calculus. And I had no problem because whether they're the regular D's or the funny script D's, there's one in the numerator, one in the denominator. You just cancel them out and go on about your work. So anyway, let's start with Erik Hurst.
I must be in the way.
So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is the importance of incorporating time empirically into our understandings of things like consumption and leisure, and maybe a little bit on inequality later today. I could really clear out a panel. Thank you very much. So what we're closer to the door. I understand it. So the way I'm thinking about things, or not me so much as others well before me, that when we start thinking about measures of household optimization that kind of maximize their utility over consumption commodities. Now, what are these consumption commodities? These consumption commodities take some expenditures from the market and take some time from the market and make some consumption good that you and I care about. And subject to the fact that we can sometimes trade off how much time we allocate to the production of a commodity relative to how much expenditure we put into the production of the commodity, you can get interesting substitution effects over over the production of a good when things like the opportunity cost of time changes, or there's innovations in the production technology within the home production sector. So this, again, stuff that Gary Becker did many years ago, not too many, but some years ago, where you wrote down the model of household optimization with this type of production function, subject to the usual type of constraints, with one additional constraint that time's got to add up across the production of different commodities. So what does this mean? Let's think about me. I like to do two things. I like to watch some TV and I like to eat. And when I'm watching TV, I have some time inputs into my television watching. I like Lost. I got to sit down. Even with TiVo, I got to spend 40 minutes for me to watch some Lost. I also have some expenditures. I like my nice flat screen TV. I like my couch. So when I'm going to enjoy my TV entertainment, there's some time and some expenditure component. Now let's think about another good that I like. I also like to eat. And when I like to eat, I also have some time component. I got to basically shop for my groceries. I got to prepare the meal. I might have to clean up. I'm kind of messy afterwards, so that there's going to be some time component for my production of the good. But I also need some expenditures. I need the food. I might need a stove. I might need some dishes or something as well. But notice across these two different types of goods, the substitutability between time and expenditure in the production of the goods might differ dramatically. If I want to spend time and watch Lost, I basically need 40 minutes of time, no matter how well I do it. Even the fancier the TV I get, or the nicer the couch, I still need roughly 40 minutes. Now on the other side, for me, for a meal, if I want to potentially substitute time for expenditure, instead of me cooking a meal and shopping for groceries, which are relatively time costly, I can pick up the phone and order Domino's, and they get deliver the pizza right to my house. And as a result, it costs me a little bit more to order Domino's pizza than it might be for me to make it myself, but I'm willing to trade off the expenditures for time. So with these types of models, what we want to think about, if we have a world with these consumption commodities, that there's this ability to trade off time and expenditure, which might be important for us in an understanding of different types of economic phenomena. So what I've spent a lot of the last few years doing, with some work with Mark Aguiar, is trying to explore the empirical importance of how much these trade-offs and substitutability are for a variety of different types of economic activity. So the first thing we're going to spend some time talking about today is actually the measuring of consumption, particularly the measuring of consumption over the life cycle, like around retirement. What happens to our spending around retirement, or as we age, as the opportunity cost of our time changes? Because there's been some speculation, or at least some early speculation, there's an empirical fact that around the moment of retirement, expenditures fall sharply. And people have interpreted this as being potentially evidence that people are ill-prepared for retirement. They don't plan well enough. Retirement's fairly predictable, so as a result they show up on the eve of retirement, and all of a sudden they retire and they can't sustain their consumption going into retirement. I'm going to show you that complication, just by looking at expenditures changing at the time of retirement, might just misguide it. And we're going to do, and I'll show you some work that Mark and I are going to do, have done on that. Then we're going to talk about other types of change, like the allocation of leisure. Usually we tend to, many people measure how much time we have in leisure relative to how much time we spend working in the market sector. Okay, which for some things might be important, but when you have innovations in other sectors of the economy, like the home production technology, and we allocate work to a variety of different or allocate time to a variety of different activities, you might get large differences in what we're going to call leisure time, depending upon the differences in, even though that might differ dramatically from market work, again, because of their substitutability with or without home production technologies. And then the last part, I want to talk about some new stuff that Mark and I have done, and it's very simple, about how do we interpret changes in inequality in a world where you also have changes in time across different goods. And this goes back to stuff that Gary might have talked about again 40-some years ago, that we might want to look at measures of full consumption as opposed to measures of actual consumption. So what I'm going to basically do for the next few minutes, and Bob's going to put up a little time when we have, I have to go because I could talk a long time. So I might go an hour just by myself without Bob prompting me. I'm going to show you about 5 pictures from each of the papers that Mark and I have written, basically trying to see. What? I understand, you guys already moved towards it. But I'm going to show you basically just 5 pictures, one from each of the papers that Mark and I have written, that kind of summarize the main points of the paper and show, again, that the empirical importance of the substitutability between time and expenditure does seem to be rather important empirically. Okay. So the first picture, this is from a paper that Mark and I had called Consumption versus Expenditure, and it was basically prompted to look at the decline, or it was prompted because we wanted to think about the decline in expenditure around the period of retirement. Sorry for me to talk and stand still. So what you should be looking at here is the age ranges on the horizontal axis. You have 3 different lines. The blue line on the bottom is what people have documented well before us, that around the period of retirement, as people age, you start seeing the sharp decline in expenditure from trend prior into the retirement years. Most people retire somewhere around the mid-60s, so you start to see the decline in expenditure going down. People have done things a lot more formal than what we've done here, actually instrumenting for retirement, showing the year before and the year after retirement, you see these big changes. But this gives you a sense of what we're trying to capture. We're going to show you 2 other lines. Okay? The first line, is the top line, you should be looking at the time people allocate using time measures, actually people asking out, what did you do yesterday? How much time do people allocate to food production in the household? This is food expenditures, I should be saying. And this is time spent to food production. How much time did you spend shopping? How much time did you spend cooking? And how much did you spend cleaning up on your meals? Notice that you start to see a sharp, dramatic increase. Again, that's on the right-hand side axis. The time measure around the retirement years. Like 66-year-olds relative to 62-year-olds spend about 50% more time shopping and home producing and cooking over this time. So you see there is this margin of substitution towards home production. So what happened to actual consumption? So what Mark and I did in this paper is we had all these definitions, or we had these food diaries from the Department of Agriculture. So not how much people spend, and not how they allocated their time. We actually measured what people were sticking in their mouths. And in a very gory details, like I knew if you were eating, 80% lean ground beef versus 90% lean ground beef, where they're eating, branded cereal versus unbranded cereal. So we have very detailed categories about the quality and quantity of what people were eating. Through a variety of statistical analysis, we've tried to make a measure of people's food consumption in permanent income dollars. And we've tried to measure that over this time period. And what you see is that despite the declining expenditure, you see relatively flat, the middle line, food consumption over the backside of the life cycle. Kind of as very much in a Friedman or a Modigliani model of life cycle consumption. Retirement's fairly predictable. People should smooth consumption across predictable periods of predictable changes in income over their lifetime. Okay. We wrote another paper now, this one called Life Cycle Prices and Production, trying to measure the mechanisms by which people could reduce their food expenditures over lifetime. So in this data, we have 3 different lines. The top line that starts with purple is going to be basically the prices people pay over the life cycle. So in this data, we actually have scanner data on what you purchase by barcodes, so we can control for quality exactly. And we actually have a large data set which observes people shopping bundles. And from this data set, you could actually observe the prices people pay in a weighted value sense over the life cycle. And what you find, as households tend to get older, they reduce the prices they pay rather substantially on their consumption bundles, again, adjusting for quality as measured by barcodes on different type of food items. And this decline is about 3% over the life cycle. So retirees, just in the terms of the price effect, not from the home production or anything else, of reallocation from Domino's to making the pizza at my house, just in terms of shopping behavior by yourself. And here you can see on the other two lines, the bottom two lines, how much time people spend grocery shopping and the number of trips they make grocery shopping over their life cycle. And you can see that there's a big, sharp increase in how much time people spend shopping over their life cycle. Now in this paper we do some other things. We could back out the applied opportunity cost of time, trading off how much people are shopping relative to the prices they pay. And we calibrate a home production technology, blah, blah, blah. But to try to get a handle on the sense of how much, to try to calibrate quantitatively whether what the profile of food expenditures will look like over the life cycle. And you see rather sharp food expenditures, both from the substitution of shopping behavior, which represented about 20% of the substitution around retirement, and about 80% from the home production, switching to pre-processed food to making the food yourself. This third paper that we're doing is a recent paper, which actually tries, instead of looking at just food, how much do we apply to our model, or the substitutability applied to non-food items, because in Gary's model, all goods are consumption commodities, it's not just food. And so we look at the life cycle profile, trying to explain the pattern of expenditures over the life cycle more broadly by looking at deconstructing all of non-durable consumption into a variety of different categories, like 12 or 13 different categories, and look at the life cycle profile of those different categories. So here are two of them. One is the food profile that people have documented before, that there's a dramatic hump shape in food over the life cycle. And people have tried to explain that over two reasons. One, food is declining on the backside of the life cycle just because people are really, really impatient. They like to eat as much as they can. Early in their life cycle, they're constrained for how much they eat because they got to accumulate some assets in order to protect them against some idiosyncratic income shocks. But once they accumulate the amount of assets they want to hold to buffer them against these potential shocks, their natural impatience kicks in and they decline their expenditures. Other people have said people just aren't good planners. Income's kind of hump-shaped over your life cycle, and you get expenditures being hump-shaped over the life cycle as well. What we show in this paper is that the hump-shaped pattern that shows up in non-durable consumption occurs in only two of the categories of the 12 or 13 that we look at, food being one of them. Okay. Lots of other categories, like entertainment, actually increases from middle age and then actually keeps on increasing through the backside of the life cycle. And if you actually decompose in a value-weighted sense, the percentage of goods that actually decline on the backside of the life cycle and how many of the goods actually stay constant on the backside of the life cycle, about 50% of the goods decline. Those tend to be food, clothing, non-durable transportation, where clothing, you can see Kevin and I are on low on the end of the clothing end. But other people, there is a work-related component of clothing, so these are far better than we wear at home. But other, so as we stop working, our dress goes down, and then our non-durable consumption goes down as well. I want to show you two other pictures. One other thing that we look at, Mark and I, another paper, is actually trying to measure trends in leisure time over the last 40 years, since 1965 through 2003. The top line is leisure. The bottom line, this is for men, is market work. Men have had a sharp decline in market work over this time period, corresponding with a big increase in leisure. The middle lines are child care and home production, basically how much time you spend cooking, cleaning, and things like that. But notice the pattern is also very similar for women. Women have also increased their amount of leisure time over this period dramatically, even adjusting for the fact that they've allocated more time to market work. So how are women able to accomplish more leisure at the same time that they're working more? The bottom line is the amount of time they've allocated to non-market production. So even understanding trends in what we could call leisure, how much time you hang out with your friends, how many times you watch loss, things of that nature. Where women, even despite their increased labor force participation, they're able to take more time allocated to these leisurely activities, even though and that's facilitated by the decline in their time to non-market work. I got like 1 minute left. I want to show you one other picture. So there's been a literature, and I think Bruce is going to spend more time talking about that at the end of today's talk, about changes in income equality and consumption equality and measures of well-being over the last 30, 40, 50 years in the United States. And he's going to use measures of market expenditures and income and things like that. What Mark and I do in another paper is we just kind of document that there's also a huge decline in leisure inequality over this time period, starting in the mid-1980s, which is the same time consumption inequality in the United States started to change. So in the mid-1980s, you start to see high-educated individuals taking more consumption gains relative to low-educated individuals, fanning out the well-being measures in the United States. On the opposite side of this is for men, you start to see that on the other side, there's a time allocation difference where the low-educated men, most of this through labor market participation, are taking much more increases in leisure relative to high-educated men over this time period. So Mark and I are saying if we want to actually measure, well-being measures between high and low-educated individuals over this time, you might need to think about a full consumption measure as opposed to just a expenditure measure to try to truly measure well-being difference. And similar patterns occur for women. So I think this is the last thing I want to say is that understanding the allocation of time is empirically important for understanding. So not just theoretically, where there's lots of literature where it says theoretically important, but empirically important for understanding movements and expenditures over the life cycle, trends in leisure, especially for women with the non-market production, and maybe changes in interpretation of rising inequality between low and high educated individuals. Cool.
We'll defer questions to the end. I think we're going to have enough time. And our next speaker is Rob Townsend from the Department of Management.
Well, my experience is contradicted by the earlier talk, which is usually with a fairly small amount of time. It's hard to get into the details of a lot of slides. So I just wanted to give you, an overview without slides of some work that's been done in Chicago on consumption, and sort of try to weave it together. The first thing I think comes to mind, of course, is Milton Friedman's famous, deservedly well-known work on the consumption function, thinking about contradictions between micro and macro data and how to reconcile them. We all now, it's second nature to use this language, permanent income, which has to do with smoothing consumption over time. But people also started to think about smoothing consumption over states of the world, over states of nature, and as it turns out, there were some theoretical insights in some work of Bob Wilson on syndicates, but very little of it, almost nothing really, had been done empirically. Jose Shankman, who was here at the time, actually, through some students, started thinking about the implications and how you would actually take it to data. The basic idea is people should be smoothing over states with the help of others, not just smoothing over time. So, first of all, let me dispel, a misconception. Risk sharing, as it's now called, doesn't mean equality. It does not mean that everyone's equal in weight and just pooling all resources together. So you can have people with high status and low status, but controlling for that, everyone's consumption should co-move in some fraction of the aggregate of whatever you have in mind. That's to say, kinship network, village, whole country, its regions, and so on. And household consumption should not move with household-specific idiosyncratic income. So that was the basic insight that comes out of Wilson's work, and it was taken to sort of cross-country data. And the first thing you see is consumption of some countries is going up while other countries is going down. There's now big literature asking why their sharing is not great across countries. And as I said, idiosyncratic income should basically not enter the picture one should control for aggregate income. This is actually relatively simple to test. You just regress household consumption or changes in household consumption onto a common fixed effect, which is meant to capture the movement of the aggregate, and also then to test against an alternative against household specific income. So it's actually quite easy to implement this kind of basic regression. And you can see whether a certain community is succeeding or failing to achieve this sort of benchmark standard. And even if it's rejected, then we kind of know what steps to take in subsequent model formulation, and I'm going to come back to that theme in just a bit. These first efforts did not try to get at, even when a given community was succeeding, why they were doing so well. In fact, it departed deliberately from earlier literature that looked at, well, labor supply or selling livestock or running down savings, each device one at a time. The idea was, in some sense, who cares, or isn't it dangerous to assume that certain items are used and not others? Why don't we just look directly at the outcomes? But coming back full fold, people now combine these tests to actually see when there is success, what devices are being used. Credit, savings, remittances, and so on. And we can understand, to talk about the household. I was introduced as Mr. Household. Just kidding, of course. But we can understand the household and what's going on within the household, but we can also understand relationships across households. So, the obvious thing to do is see whether households connected by blood and marriage, in other words, kinship groups, are successful at achieving this standard. And in some work also done here, Cochrane and Mace, Barbara was a student at the time, John Cochrane, did some well-known work on this using US data with some difference in the findings. I took this to developing countries, to villages in India, and showed, surprisingly to myself and to many people, just how well relatively poor villages in India do within the village at sharing idiosyncratic risk. This created quite a firestorm because there were people predisposed to believe that there's no way poor households could do very well. I can't say that without thinking of Ted Schultz and the presumption that penny capitalism was the term to use. God for this whole pack. So these villages are doing well. This has pretty dramatic policy implications because it would suggest that rather than targeting individuals per se, you might think about targeting villages and allow the local institutions, such as they are, to intermediate. And lately people have been doing this in Mexico with these progressive transfers. I don't think it's exactly the right experiment, but it does turn out that people not getting the transfers have also experienced increase in consumption as if they were in some kind of risk-sharing network. I don't want to just leave you thinking about villages, though. You should think about large industrial conglomerates. In many countries, there are family-related syndicates. Some of the largest companies in Thailand, but also Mexico, India, in Barcelona, these are a big issue. So with advanced industrial economies, think about conglomerates as being bad in the sense of tunneling, but it's possible, on the other hand, that these conglomerates are really sort of working at reallocating risk and credit within the family group and in this larger sea of imperfect credit markets. And we've had students here, some Pantarak work on that, for example. This is really good Chicago tradition that says this work is done by students, not just by faculty. It's often done in collaboration with faculty members. So, when you get into it, you begin to think about all the different applications. You can think about regions in a country. You could look at flow of funds to see how they're accomplished. It turns out in some countries that look like they have advanced systems, financial systems, a lot of the smoothing is being done nevertheless by remittances, which are, family obviously gives, sending them back home, but not just always in constant amount or in proportion to earnings, but rather sent more when the recipient unit is having a bad year. So it's not to say these things work perfectly, but the theory gave us something to look for in the data. It was a way of organizing the empirical work. And you can look at business cycle risks, to see exactly who's bearing the risk of the aggregate fluctuations, which leads to, a recent dissertation, Sam Topel allows for differential risk aversion. So the piece of the aggregate that you're supposed to get according to the theory can change according to the theory based on your relative risk aversion. Just think about risk neutral people as an extreme absorbing most of the risk, and there's some evidence that if it worked perfectly well, then you could free up your choice of occupation and base that on talent, and not have to do the choice of occupation based on the risk profile that comes out of it. So as I'm saying, the theory is being extended now to not only allow differential risk aversion, but to estimate it in the data. This is kind of an exciting direction to take. We can also include labor supply. So the same logic applies, especially if, say, just to think about it, consumption is separable, and it may not be, but if it were separable in leisure and consumption, then all these sort of pooling implications apply to labor supply, not just to consumption. So we can see, if among a group of otherwise identical people, leisure is basically moving in the data. Or another way to put this is to go back to kind of like Frisch demand functions and test within a household whether individual labor supply varies with that person's wage, as it should, according to the theory, and varies with household income, as it should, according to the theory, but doesn't vary particularly component by component with the wages of other family members, only through the aggregated effect on the budget. And this is, again, something that is ongoing research. Andre Yapori has been working on related things. We're doing some stuff together. The point being that this stuff has been going on at Chicago. Now we come to sort of modifications of the theory. How am I doing for time? Just think about, is leisure observable? If it's not, and the first leisure being effort. So if you can't control leisure, people can shirk, and you wouldn't expect to have full risk sharing. So you can come back and think about households' choices of occupations, because different occupations have different risk profiles. Maybe going into business is a risky thing, and due to the moral hazard problem, you have to absorb some of the risk. We should see a relationship between initial wealth and the ability to go into business. Under the full observability of effort, you have the usual neoclassical separation of household production activities from consumption, and but in the case of unobservable things like effort, you break that separation, and so initial wealth matters for household choices. Now it turns out, with the same apparatus, basically, you start appending various potential obstacles to trade, not just moral hazard, but limited commitment, unwillingness to pay off a loan, for example, and some work I've done with Anna Paulson and Alex Garibanov. We kind of figured out how to test and distinguish in the data, which obstacle or which combination of obstacles jointly explain wealth and the decision of the what occupation. Obviously, you could extend the data to include, we've measured it, consumption, and various things, and get more power to these tests. The point is, when there are these obstacles to trade, endowments matter. So you would expect to see people making efforts ex ante to diversify rather than relying ex post on informal or formal insurance mechanisms. And some work I did was representative of that, modeling medieval village economies and looking at this rather dramatic picture of fragmentation of land. But just think about it as a portfolio problem, different plots yielding different, field in looking at villages. They're realistic ways to think about the problem in both contexts. So the issue is how much fragmentation do we see, how much ex-ante effort do people make to diversify. John Eaton and W. Lucas kind of look at these things in terms of occupation choices being influenced by the imperfect credit markets. And we can put in ex post bargaining and try to distinguish that from ex-ante risk sharing. I want to close with thinking about how markets handle these problems. So suppose we imagine there are all these obstacles to trade, limited information, and so on. Just to plant some seeds, imagine that what a firm is maybe is sort of an internal monitoring device. That is to say, people get together within firms to try to pool resources in a way they couldn't because there are disincentives and limited commitment to using the market. But what I'm not saying the markets are bad. I'm saying ex-ante markets in the bundling of people works. Basically, you can price people's talents and preferences and other things enter in, and you can see, sort of do an assignment problem, so that a firm is basically an assignment of people into clubs or collections. And you do have the usual pricing. The firms that exist, will basically produce enough revenue to cover these costs. You can think about families that way. You can go to, say, Professor Becker's work on the family, and instead of thinking about bargaining over the division of things, think about a Walrasian market in which you have people who differ in wealth, in education, and the market is basically allocating people and pairing them up. And actually you can show under fairly mild conditions that you will sort of recover the usual welfare theories that the competitive equilibria with these marriage markets will be optimal, and all the optima can be supported if you have appropriate redistribution transfers. So I'll try to end on time.
Again, let's hold our questions to the end, and our next speaker is Meyer.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to talk about two areas of research with graduate students and co-authors that echo the same themes that Erik and Rob talked about. On the bottom?
Next to the 17%.
Right there? That. Thank you. Gotta be a better way.
Clear stand.
Great. Not working.
Click on it.
I'm sorry?
Click on it. Click on your cursor doesn't on it. Skip it. Click.
Got it. Okay. I'm sorry?
Take down the word.
Now it works. Empty it. Okay, I'm gonna try to figure out another way. So the two strands of work are on what we can learn about the well-being of households from consumption data, and to a lesser extent, time use data. And then the other strand of work is the effects of government programs that insure households against the negative consequences of bad events, bad shocks, like unemployment or disability. And I should mention that Friedman's 57 book emphasized that 1 year of income data is not a good way to look at the well-being of households or measure the resources of households. And he emphasized the use of consumption data. And I hope to get to talk a little bit about time use data and non-market time, as emphasized by Gary in the 65 paper. In a series of papers with Jim Sullivan, we argued that if you want to look at the poor, you want to look at consumption rather than income. And there are a lot of reasons to look at consumption rather than income. The standard argument probably is the permanent income hypothesis or the life cycle model. But Rob mentioned insurance, which may mean that differences in household or government insurance over time or across individuals may affect consumption, but not income. If you look at the original Friedman book, he emphasized measurement issues much more than I remembered. I had the occasion to look back over it over the weekend, and he really emphasized a lot of measurement and statistical issues, maybe given his statistical background. And he even mentioned that when you look at things like housing and vehicles, you want to look at the flow of resources from ownership of those durable assets rather than look at expenditure. And that's something that you can do with consumption data rather than, but you wouldn't pick up now, consumption data are also much more suited to a number of conceptual refinements that you can't usually do with income data. You may, in looking at a measure of well-being, want to subtract out work expenses. You may want to subtract out child care expenses. You can do that with expenditure data. You can't do it with income data. If you want to calculate the value of housing consumption, you need to know some attributes of the housing unit. And again, that's something that you will more naturally have in consumption data. If you want to get a better measure of well-being, you'll probably not want to include out-of-pocket medical expenses because they're more likely to reflect need or lack of good insurance rather than well-being. And you may want to include only those who share resources, which is something that's very naturally done in consumption data because our standard consumption data sources ask about who shares resources, but that's not a question that comes up in income data. Now, when you think about more measurement type issues, which again was what Friedman emphasized a fair amount in his book, you will find that things are more split in terms of whether income or consumption is a better way to get well-being. We think that it's probably easier for most people to report their income than their consumption, but income is a much more sensitive topic than consumption. People are much more willing to tell you how much they spent on a house than how much they earned last year. And you find that reflected in much higher non-response rates in the standard income data than the standard consumption data. And there's also a lot of underreporting of income. This is a figure that shows the fraction of various transfers that are reported for various years in the current population survey or main source of income data. And you'll see that the fraction that's reported is often a lot less than 1 and has gone down over time for quite a few of these government programs. Now, other evidence to suggest that consumption might be a better measure of resources at the bottom than income is that expenditures often exceed income for families with few resources. Often, expenditures exceed income by a multiple of 2 or 3. Consumption is also more strongly associated with other measures of well-being for those at the bottom. And you can see that this distinction between income and consumption really matters for some important groups. Let me give you a quick example. This shows the change in consumption and income for different deciles of the consumption or income distribution between a period right before welfare reform and right after. And you can see that if you look at income, it suggests that there was a huge increase in deprivation in the bottom decile, with income going way down. But on the other hand, if you look at consumption in the bottom decile, the changes were similar for the bottom decile as other groups. And people have used this decline in income in the bottom decile to say that this was a real problem with welfare reform. But you clearly just don't see it when you look at consumption. Now, I'm going to now look at other measures of poverty over time for the entire population, then some subgroups using consumption and income, and you'll see that you get very different answers. You might be a little bit skeptical of our standard income numbers for poverty because the official poverty rate now is almost the same as it was in 1970, despite now the problems of obesity rather than malnutrition. And if you look at disadvantaged groups, you'll see that they have just much higher rates of living in air-conditioned apartments, having dishwashers, having washers and dryers. So there are a lot of basic evidence that probably suggests to you that the official numbers are wrong. But here is some more evidence. So here, the line here is consumption, and the consumption measure of poverty. And the top line is the official measure. We've anchored them all in 1980 to be the same. And you can see that the consumption measure has fallen quite a bit further. Though the differences between a better income measure and a consumption measure aren't that stark. Here, looking at the aggregate for all people, you'll see when we look at subgroups or other measures of poverty, the differences are starker. So let me show you poverty gaps. That's the amount of money that you need to lift everyone up to the poverty line. And when you look at what's happened to poverty gaps with income, over the last 24 years, they've not trended appreciably, but gone up in recent years. On the other hand, if you look at consumption, consumption poverty gaps have gone down over time, pretty consistent. And many people think that this is a better measure than the headcount poverty measure because it accounts for how far people are below the poverty line. Okay. Now, another issue that I should mention, which isn't directly related to consumption, but that's that we use a price index to measure inflation in the official poverty line that dramatically overstates inflation. And that's due to a number of biases: substitution bias, quality bias, and good and output biases in consumer price index. The Boskin Commission concluded that the bias was more than 1.3 percentage points per year. Now, Boskin Commission had at least 2 former Chicago faculty members on it. I don't really know the background of the others. But you may not want to just believe me. The Onion said that in a recent report that the quality, the cost of living now outstrips life benefits for many Americans. So there's further evidence that the price index has been going up too fast. But when you use a better price index that accounts for the bias that we think is present in the CPI, then you see that measures of poverty fall even more quickly, and this is more true for consumption measures than income measures because of where it cuts in the distribution. Consumption is just much less dispersed than income. And when you look at the aged, the differences between consumption and income are more stark. That shouldn't be surprising given that the aged are going to be saving, and that's not going to be picked up by an income measure. Also, more than 80% of those 65 and older have a car, have a house, and the services of those durables are included in income that are properly included in consumption. Okay. So there are quite a few differences between income and consumption. Let me now talk a little bit about insurance. And what I'm showing here is the change in food and housing consumption after disability for different groups of the disabled. And I'm going to focus mostly on this most disabled group, this chronic severe group. And you'll see that after disability, there's a big fall in consumption. The 0 point is the time at which people are willing to say they're disabled, but there's evidence that something is going on before that people are somewhat impaired and they know that their future prospects don't look as good as they used to, but they're not ready to say they're disabled. So you see that food and housing consumption falls a lot after disability onset for the most disabled. And we were worried about how to interpret this. Is this something that is just analogous to the retirement phenomenon that Erik discussed? And you could imagine that when a person gets disabled, that the value of additional expenditure to them either goes up or down. They no longer can take the vacations that they used to, but they might have greater value, greater demand for an apartment in a building with an elevator, or a single level home, or a car with adaptations. So it's really an empirical issue. But I want to emphasize that the consumption numbers that I showed you for a family with a disabled head are at the family level. So it's really 3.5 or 4 people on average who have seen their food and housing consumption go down. So the effect of disability on the head probably isn't as important as you might first think. So then we examine some of the same issues that Erik and Mark Aguilar looked at, because they find that the fall in expenditure on food may not be the same as a fall in consumption due to more time spent preparing food, more time spent shopping. And so we examined whether this same pattern holds for the disabled. And let me show you that no, there really is a fall in the quality of food that the disabled are consuming. So if you look at calories or various vitamin measures, those are much worse for the disabled than the non-disabled, after accounting for a lot of attributes of the disabled. And if you look at time spent preparing food or time shopping, there is a small increase in time spent preparing food. The other measures don't change really at all. But you should realize that in terms of efficiency units, given on average, the degree of physical limitations of the disabled, it's not clear that this is much of an increase. It's small in any case. And then if you look at other measures, if you look at time use of the spouse, spent shopping, spent preparing food, those go down slightly. So there's really no evidence of the same kind of phenomena that you see for the aged for retirees, for the disabled. So it looks like it really is a decline in well-being for the disabled. So let me also emphasize, you don't see a large increase in vacation time for the disabled. You do see a big increase in the use of medical services. This is time spent going to the doctor. That goes up dramatically. There's an increase in time of sleep and a lot of TV, a big increase in TV watching in the disabled. But it doesn't look like there's a big increase in quality leisure. So to summarize, food consumption falls 20% for the chronic and severe disabled, the most disabled. Food plus housing about 24%. And there seems to be incomplete insurance against disability, even with the programs that we have, such as Social Security Disability Insurance and SSI. Doesn't mean that things aren't optimal, but that there's this big decline in consumption needs to be weighed against the moral hazard effects of these programs.
Well, I get to see these guys all the time, so we'll, I'm asking you the questions that I have. So are there any questions from the floor? Get right over here.
I guess my question is regarding, I guess causation of consumption. I guess everyone's kind of assuming that as you get older, like Eric, like you would assume that a person is going to consume less as they get older. They're just not as hungry, they're going to eat less food. I mean, is it just? It's just a coincidence that that's when their income is less. I mean, how do we?
There's two things. So when we start thinking about the consumption of the really aging, where these kinds of concerns will be much more important, thinking about the biological profile of how much we actually want to consume is going to be important. So what we try to do in most of our stuff is try to limit things to the relatively young old. So basically most of our analysis is up to 68, 69, somewhere in there. Now that doesn't mean that, some of the, the fact that health shocks occur to some people and the fact that health shocks occur and then, my dad gets cancer, he just doesn't want him to go play as much golf or doesn't want to eat as much hamburgers as he used to do. So those kind of things are going to be important. I don't think, we understand, or at least empirically, about the relationship between health shocks and desired consumption, or aging and desired consumption as much as we should. So we try to limit things to where parts of the distribution where health shocks are less important. Now, saying that, regardless, we have measures of actual intake. And for the range that we look at, actual intake, despite declining expenditure, is relatively constant. So maybe it could actually be going up more because of some of the concerns you have, but it's basically not well proxied by the changes in expenditure, and that's kind of the theme we were making.
Two questions over here.
Bruce, in terms of, what about the mildly disabled, which is the more active policy fund that you do, like the marginal people going on, there's been a big increase in the number of people going on disability, mostly among the people who aren't severely disabled. Have you looked at all at time allocation issues and some of these other things from that?
Well, I should say that this most disabled group that I emphasized, almost all of disability insurance receipt is in that group. You probably can learn a fair amount by looking at that group. We can't.
The marginal people.
Yeah,
That's the issue.
how to identify the marginal people? I'm just, maybe I will ask you later how I can do that.
But the time diaries don't have a lot of health measures to go along with it. So you got a disabled, you can get, amount of receipt of disability insurance or something like that to try to cut things. But the time diaries data just don't have a lot of health measures associated with it. So
You got a big increase in the number of people who call themselves disabled, but any medical measure seems to say that people are not sicker than they used to.
Well, there's a little bit of disagreement about that.
All other health factors show people at all ages are healthy.
But now, there's more of a premium on your intellectual ability in your 50s and 60s. Before, it's more physical aspects. So it's not so clear that people are, on average, as functioning intellectually quite as well, in 50s and 60s. So I'm just echoing the papers that I've seen on sort of the health of people in their 50s and 60s. I think when you go towards older ages, there's more clear evidence that conditional on getting there, people are healthier. But if you look at women, for example, disability rates have gone up most quickly for women, and they're working more. So it's more likely they're going to suffer a work-related disability than they used to.
Erik? I have a question for Rob and maybe Erik. It's on family pools. There are two theories about family pools. One is there's altruism in the family, so we automatically get applicants for insurance and pool risk as a consequence of that. The other is pure risk sharing. The family is, it's not like an insurance company. They have some advantages. They can monitor moral hazard problem, short stories, because we know each other. Now, if you look at your data, to some extent that's true also in your time position. You have risk share, which would come under each theory. Can you say anything about distinguishing between these two ways of getting risk share? Because they're not, they have other implications. For example, we had a certain change from, we were in a family, you have a parent on the child, let's say, you were known by retirement you had a certain income, right? And there's no altruism. Well, we're not going to pool that kind of risk because that's a known event. Nobody's going to be surprised about it. On the other hand, an altruistic model, you may get pooled.
Well, actually, the implications of that sort of maximize weighted sums of utilities subject to sort of resource constraints they apply even without the shock. So you should smooth over time. It doesn't matter how the aggregate consumption bundle is determined. Once it's there, it should be, if you believe the theory, pooled across the households. So
within a household? Within a household?
Yeah.
Well, do you know that some people earn a permanent income much higher than others, and they just go on that, and there's no altruism? Why should they be pooled?
Yeah. So I think this is the conversation about can we distinguish the Pareto weight from the consumption share, and the altruism thing plays into that. We could be selfish about each other's utility and maximize some weighted sum of utility functions, so-called lambda weighted sum. But if you're altruistic and you care about the other guy, even for given lambdas, maybe the weights are a bit different. So then to test altruism is kind of a tricky business because you have to think about whether the backed out Pareto weights would be consistent with other things we know. But one thing I did in that paper on India was to look to estimate the Pareto weights across the different households and then distinguish rich from poor. And there was a lot more, this is consistent with some of these slides, there's a lot more compression in consumption than there is in wealth, even over a 10-year period. So then, you kind of wonder, is there some norm that sort of, even though these Brahmins, don't get their hands dirty in the fields, they're out there just sort of monitoring the other people, they're nevertheless somehow through customs giving up a lot more than you would think. So it looks like it's not just sort of the market allocation. It looks like there's some redistribution, which maybe altruism, maybe other things. but there's certainly a lot more work needs to be done to try to get at it.
But you know, the autonomy stuff, which claims
Yeah.
you don't get much transfer, there's one part of this.
Well, the early autonomy stuff was very confused because they actually postulated that every individual in this, every household in the larger cluster of connected dynasty households ought to have the same levels of consumption. And the theory just doesn't, risk sharing or these others just doesn't require that.
No, I've never looked at any of the transfers across households within a family, so I won't have anything more to say.
Any other questions? Well, we're right on schedule. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks to the speakers.